This sermon is from Edgewood Baptist Church. You can find more information about us online at ebc-edmonds.org. Thanks for listening.
Working here has given me the opportunity to spend a lot of time with generations other than my own, which has been interesting, to say the least. And differences aside, there's a lot of things that I've come to really admire and respect about some of our older generations. And one of those things, there's many, but one of those things that I was pondering recently is just the fact that it seems like as I get to know some of you and I hear stories about how you met your significant other, with older generations, there seems to be a lot more clarity in romantic pursuits. Meaning that instead of taking like the millennial approach and be like, hey, you want to get coffee? You would go walk up to somebody and say, would you like to go on a date with me? It's beautiful. It's precise. I understand your intentions. It's great. And it irritates me sometimes when I talk to people my own age and I'm like, hey, I saw you hanging out with so-and-so. What's the deal there? I don't know. Are you guys dating? I don't know. Have you been on dates? I don't know. It's rough, right? And so it seems like as I talk with older generations, you walk up and say, so would you like to go on a date with me? Yes, you go to the soda parlor or the drive-in movie or whatever you guys did. And then like 6 weeks later, you're married, and 6 weeks later, you have a house and 7 kids, right? Like it's quick and precise. And so you may not be familiar with the term, but in the midst of the romantic ambiguity of the millennial generation, there's a term, the DTR. And maybe some of you saw that as part of our title this morning. I had a couple of people ask me, and I made them wait to hear what a DTR is. A DTR is a define the relationship conversation. So in the midst of the ambiguity of the millennials and their romantic pursuits, occasionally you'll sit down with somebody and it's usually really awkward and you say, hey, what is this? Are we dating? Are we friends? Are we thinking about dating? And finally kind of nail that down a bit. So I got to tell you though, Tamara and I are the exception to the rule. I was pretty quick to ask for a commitment and pretty quick to propose to her, mostly because I was trying to catch her off guard so that she would say yes before she realized she could do much better than me, right? So what we have in Exodus today is essentially the very first DTR. Now, not because God is vague or ambiguous, but because at this point in the history of the nation of Israel, they needed clarity. And so we get the define the relationship talk between God and his people. Before we jump into that, though, let me remind you and just have you ponder with me for a second what's happening in the book of Exodus at this point. Because I think understanding what God has been doing at this point absolutely changes our understanding of the Ten Commandments. It helps us see with clarity what God has been doing. So in the book of Exodus, think about it, up to this point, Israel has been in slavery for 400 years. 400 years. Remember, they went into Egypt while Joseph was there, and Joseph was in power, and through God's working, Joseph was able to provide for his family so that they didn't die out in the famine. But as Joseph passes away and generations come and go and new people take leadership in Egypt, the Israelites go from being guests to being slaves there in Egypt. So they've been in slavery 400 years. They're not treated well, obviously, as slaves, but just think with me for a second, ponder that, what that would be like. 400 years, it doesn't sound that long, but let me remind you, 400 years ago, the United States was not a country. It was like a colony at Jamestown, and the whole thing with Pocahontas went down, right? That's a long time. 400 years they've been in slavery there. Now, help me out. Show of hands, who knows, by God's grace, all 4 of your grandparents? You got to meet and spend some time with and know the names and interacted with all of them. Okay? You don't have to be shy. It's okay. It's not a trick question. Okay, how about great-grandparents? Anybody know any of their great-grandparents? Okay. Anybody know the names, at least, of all of their great-great-grandparents? A couple of hands, all right? If you've got your hand up, you may have spent some time on Ancestry.com, but that's not a paid endorsement. But think, 400 years That would be like knowing people in your lineage all the way back to the colony at Jamestown. And so you've got this entire group of people, this entire generation, they've only known slavery. They don't have conversations and sit back and say, hey, you remember when we used to barbecue on the weekends and throw the frisbee? That's great. They've only known slavery. So there's some oral tradition, I'm sure, where they know about Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, and they know about their lineage, and they know about their ancestors, and they remember stories of before slavery in Egypt. But they themselves have only known slavery. And this is the situation that exists as God brings them out. And so God frees his people from bondage. Right, he uses Moses and Aaron, and God works through those guys and delivers the people of Israel from Egypt. This is where the 10 plagues come in, and it's really interesting. If you look, each of the 10 plagues, there's kind of a system there by which God is showing himself more powerful than the Egyptian gods. And I'm not going to sit here and go through all of them, but you can imagine that it would be really embarrassing for Ra, the Egyptian sun god, when the sky goes dark. Right? This is embarrassing for them. And so finally at Passover, Pharaoh's hard heart relinquishes. He lets the Israelites go, and this people experience freedom for the first time. God does this for them. And so then we get to Sinai here in Exodus chapter 20, and God gives his instructions to his people to live out their newly attained freedom. God's sharing with them, here's how you live. Here's what your life should look like, right? Martin Luther put it this way, thus we have in the 10 Commandments a summary of divine instructions telling us what we have to do to make our whole life pleasing to God and showing us the true source and fountain from and in which all good works must spring forth and proceed. Here's the summary of what our lives should look like. And what I came to realize as I was spending some time in the 10 Commandments recently is just that these instructions are an act of grace from God, right? God's grace sustained the people in Egypt. God's grace delivered the people from Egypt. God's grace has sustained them as they're out in the wilderness. And now we get God's grace in his giving them instructions, in his explaining to them how they're supposed to live. And so J.I. Packer put it this way, that for Christians today, as for the Jews at Sinai, law-keeping as meeting the claims of our God is not an attempt to win God's admiration and put him in our debt, but the form and substance of grateful personal response to his love. Right? In other words, the 10 Commandments are the responses to God's grace. This is the way our lives should be modeled, as a response to the work of God in our lives. And so because of that, it strikes me a little bit odd that the 10 Commandments typically get displayed at courthouses. Now, I'm all for public expressions of our faith so that people can see our God. Right? But the sense then when they're tied to a courthouse is a bit different, and it's just, these are things you have to do. And instead, I think if we look at the context, what we see is these are the things that God would like from us as a response to what he's done for us. Not as a means of earning his favor, not as a means of putting God in our debt, but just this is the way you should live in response to what's happened. Now, you and I know what it's like to be liberated from bondage if you're a believer in Jesus. We were in debt to our slave. Christ has freed us. And here are some ways that our lives should be patterned then as a response to that grace that we've encountered. Let's jump into Exodus 19, just a little bit before we get the beginning of the 10 Commandments, starting at verse 3. So Moses goes up to God. The Lord called to him out of the mountain, saying, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." In other words, God's got big plans for this group of people. It wasn't arbitrary. God was looking around and he was like, all right, well, let's free the Israelites. Okay, what else can we do today? Says, no, I had a plan. I had a purpose. I'm going to use you to do something in the world. Right? To jump to verse 16. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. Imagine that scene. Put yourself there at the foot of the mountain with the nation of Israel. They've actually kind of roped it off and said, nobody come past the base of the mountain or you'll die. In fact, if an animal gets loose, goodbye Fido, right? If anything is to come up on this mountain other than Moses and Aaron, death, because something amazing and holy is happening here. And I've climbed a few mountains in Washington, none of the big ones, but a few. And just imagine if you've been on the top of a mountain, standing there and feeling the whole thing tremble. I mean, I go up to the top of mountains and look at it and just feel small, but imagine the thing shaking. And so the people of Israel are watching as this happens, and there's thunder and lightning, and the mountain is shaking, and God begins to speak and reveal himself to them. Exodus 20. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So here opens the Ten Commandments, and God starts with reminding them what's been happening, right? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Think about who God is as he begins to give them instructions. And so let me just, with you this morning, point out three things that I think you and I should see and recognize in this first commandment. This first one, right, so profound. It's 3 whole words long, right? God is personal. I don't think any of you are going to be impressed with that phrase, right? But I hope that you're impressed with that concept. Let that sink in for just a moment, that God desires and defines a relationship with his people. The infinite, all-powerful, all-knowing, omnipotent God who created every single thing in the universe and sustains every bit of it by his power wants to know you. I mean, let that sink in, right? Because God doesn't need us. And yet he desires a relationship with us. He knows everything, right? There's nothing that you're ever going to say that God's going to be like, oh, that's a good point. Thank you. You've clarified my understanding of that. And yet he desires a relationship with you. There's not a single task too big for God that he needs you or I to come along and say, hey, listen, let me help you out. And he desires a relationship with us. God is personal. He's relational. He wants a relationship with you. And I've been thinking lately just about how important doctrine is. And in the midst of a society that likes to think of themselves as spiritual but not religious, it matters that we would say God is not just some consciousness state of being. God's not some cosmic force, some source of energy that runs through the whole universe, but God is a relational being who can be known. And he's revealed himself so that you and I can know him accurately. And then, as we keep reading through the Bible, we see Jesus come and perfectly exemplify this idea that God is personal, right? Jesus gets called Emmanuel, God with us, right? Clint the other night was speaking in student ministry and called Jesus God with a bod, which I thought was Awesome, right? So Jesus comes, Emmanuel, God with us, so that we can know God even more. Edmund Clowney pointed out some similarities between God speaking at Mount Sinai and the transfiguration of Jesus that happened on the mountain. So let me share this with you. Buckle up, it's a bit long, right? But I thought it was great. On the mountain one day, Peter, James, and John saw the radiance of Jesus' glory. Brilliant light streamed from his face and his robe. They must have begun to understand how Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets as Moses and Elijah stood there beside Jesus, Moses representing the law and Elijah the prophets. These representatives of the Old Testament covenant spoke with Jesus about his exodus, which was his saving deliverance through the cross. The same cloud of God's glory and his presence that had enveloped Sinai enveloped them on this mountain. In the terror of that darkness, the disciples heard the voice of God, the same voice that had sounded from Sinai. At Sinai, God had spoken 10 commandments. On the mountain of Jesus' glory, the voice of God the Father spoke only one commandment. This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him. It was not an 11th commandment, a kind of appendix, or even an amendment to the law. When Jesus came, it was to fulfill the law, which he did by perfectly fulfilling the very first of the 10 commandments. Shall have no other gods before me. God is personal. He desires and defines a relationship with his people. J.I. Packer said it really, really well. Now, the Christian's relationship with God, the Creator, is a personal I-you affair throughout. To him, God is not, as he is to some, a cosmic force to harness an infinite it, claiming no more from him than the genie of the lamp did from Aladdin. Christians know that God has called them into a relationship of mutual love and service, of mutual listening and response, of asking, giving, taking, and sharing on both sides. God is personal, and you and I are invited into relationship with him. But then we get a little bit more specific, right? God says, have no other gods before me. So number 2, God desires a relationship that's not just to be prioritized, it's to be exclusive. This is it. In fact, the language there of this first commandment is very similar to the way that marriage is spoken of often in the Old Testament. It's this very personal language, and so we should worship, love, seek, serve, and trust God more than anything else. And just imagine those of you who are married. If your spouse walked into the living room this afternoon and said, hey, I've been thinking, you're great, but I was just thinking, like, what if we had another couple of husbands who might be able to help out a little bit? You're like, no. This is it. It's you and I. We don't need to introduce a third party here. And so God defines his relationship with his people, but he defines one and says it will be exclusive. I'm not interested in sharing you with other gods. I'm not interested in sharing you with other pursuits. I used to always think of idolatry as just being like an either-or kind of thing. Well, you could worship God or you could worship this. And I think what makes more sense and is more true to life and more true for the Israelites and more true for you and I is that idolatry is not an either-or thing. It's an and thing. It's like, well, I'm going to worship God, and maybe I'll try to pull some other things alongside God and worship those alongside as well. So the temptation for the Israelites would have been to worship and intermingle with some of the false gods of the nations that they were surrounded by. Like, well, yeah, Yahweh, God, he's pretty great, but the Canaanites have this God that's supposed to help our crops, so we'll worship Yahweh, God, but we'll also just kind of do a little offering over here to the side in hopes that our crops would be sustained. We'll worship Yahweh, God, and Dagon, the Philistine God, yeah, sure, bring him in as well. Right? Or you and I, yeah, I'll worship God, but my comfort is just really, really important to me. And if the two are in conflict, I'm going to protect my comfort a little bit more than I do my worship of God. Right? If we look and we see what are the things that you put your time, your talent, and your treasure in, what are the things that you're pursuing, right? all of them should be rooted first and foremost in your relationship with God. Which is not to say that we don't have other pursuits in our lives, but just that those pursuits find their source in God. Right? We talk often about Matthew 22, 36 to 40, where one of the Sadducees comes and says, "Teacher, what is the great commandment in the law?" And Jesus answers him. Jesus said unto him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." Right? That's exclusive language right there, right? This is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, right? There are other pursuits that then find their root, find their source in our worship of God. But God designs a relationship that's supposed to be exclusive. Martin Luther, in one of his catechisms, put it this way: whatever thy heart clings to and relies upon, that is properly thy God. So I think you and I, like the Israelites may have been tempted to, we tend to just try to slide some things in and say, I'm going to worship God, but I also want to bring in my comfort. I also want to worry about my reputation. I also want to worry about my advancement in my workplace or whatever it might be. We're trying to worship things alongside God. But at the heart of every bit of idolatry, right, it is really you and I saying, God, you're not sufficient. God, you're not enough for me. And so I want to worship you. I want to have a relationship with you, but I also need this other thing on the side because you can't fulfill every need, every desire that I have. But God designed us to worship him and him only. Everything else is idolatry. I love the closing of Jude, such a short little book, but it ends with verse 25, "To the only God, our Savior, through Jesus Christ our Lord, be glory, majesty, dominion, and authority before all time and now and forevermore. Amen." The only God. I love that at the end of his epistle there, Jude reinforces this idea. There is one God, and you and I should pursue him with everything that we have. But I don't think God brought the Israelites out of Egypt, out of oppression, just to bring them out in the wilderness and then oppress them more. Right? God brought them out, like we said earlier, because he was doing something through them. He says, you're going to be to me a nation of priests, a royal, holy nation. Right? God didn't bring them out to oppress them. He brought them out to give them freedom and to give them life. So point 3 this morning is just that godly living brings joy and life. I believe that the Ten Commandments weren't spoken to oppress Israel, right, but to give them more and abundant life. Right? Jesus himself confirmed when he came, right? I didn't come, or I came to bring life and to bring it more abundantly. Right? And so when we look through the Ten Commandments and we get to the prohibition against working on the Sabbath, right? That's not because God is oppressive. It's because God looks at his people and says, hey, you are more than just a mechanism for producing things. Take a break. Work is good, but that's not the sum total of your existence. Right? We look at the prohibition against adultery, and that's not repressive. It's God saying, no, marriage and the family, I've designed those with intentionality. They're important, and they need to be protected. When God speaks about not bearing false witness, it's not because he's wanting to oppress them, but because it's, hey, your reputation matters and it should not be tarnished. You should be careful in the ways that you speak about people. Right? This is God bringing joy and life. And what I believe we'll see is that not just the Ten Commandments, but all of God's Word, if we understand it correctly, is there to bring you and I joy. Is there to bring you and I life. Even the things that seem hard, even the things that seem difficult, even the things that I don't understand, even the things that I, in and of myself, would like not to conform to, are there because God is so much more holy, so much more wise, so much more loving, so much more caring than I am, that he cares enough to say, don't do that. It will be destructive for you. Let me show you the way of life. Paul in the book of Galatians, speaking about the Judaizers, and he says this, for freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to the yoke of slavery. Right? Don't allow yourself to be pressed. Christ has liberated you. Just like he liberated the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt, we said earlier, you have been released. If you know Jesus, you've trusted in him as the Lord, the Savior, the boss, the treasure of your life. You have been freed from the bondage of slavery. And God has given us instructions so that you and I could continue to live in that freedom, to know the joy and the life that he's come to offer. So what the band and the ushers make their way forward. But as we do, I'd like to ask you, grab the connection card out of your bulletin if you grabbed one of those, and just look at a couple of options, a couple of things that I'd like to encourage you to do in light of what we just talked about the Ten Commandments. So number one there, I will read Exodus 19 and 20 and think about how God's grace is displayed in the giving of the Ten Commandments. Exodus 19 being the setup for the Ten Commandments, and Exodus 20 being the Ten Commandments themselves. Just read those, ponder those. I will seek to minimize distractions and pursue God first and foremost in the way I conduct myself this week. Right? Maybe you'd say, there is something else that I keep trying to slide alongside my worship of God, something I'm trying to bring in alongside worshiping God, and maybe it's this week I need to push that thing off and focus on my relationship with God, or maybe this week just memorize that first commandment, memorize Exodus 20, verse 2 and 3.